Hello and welcome back to this Downful Idealistic Crusade. This is the fourth in my series of reread and comparison videos talking about the classic original canon series of the Hardy Boys, one of the most iconic series in all of children's literature. However, when you talk about the actual books themselves, and in particular the first 38 volumes, they were all subjected to a long-running revision process that either slightly altered, dramatically altered, or completely rewrote the original books. And since they were all ghostwritten anyway, under the same Franklin W. Dixon moniker as part of the Stratemeyer Syndicate, it was not something you were going to be aware of unless you were actually comparing the books or had read the original texts. When the revised text sort of took over starting in 1959, and then the books were rewritten over a long period by different authors and updated to the time at which they were written, and with varying degrees of alterations, as I said before. So it is a really fascinating thing to do as an adult, to go back and read all of the books and do what I'm doing in this series, finally doing a back-to-back comparison, reading the revised text I grew up with, and then reading immediately thereafter the original text, which are almost always longer and more really grittier tales because they were written originally in the 20s and 30s. They do, of course, have some bits of very... Well, really, they are obviously going to be dated to the times in which they were written. The only negative is, of course, they do have occasionally, depending on the book, there are some outdated bits of cultural stereotyping. They are, fortunately, usually rather minor. Some books have a bit more of this than others. It's never anything that's terrible, but it is a regrettable part of how popular culture used to not perceive these things as being insensitive when they've always been that way. It's just an artifact of these books being written in the 20s and 30s. And that was the reason given as the impetus for doing this revision process, if anybody ever paid attention or asked about it. And you will still occasionally see the rare article pop up talking about the original unaltered text for both the Hardy Boys and the sister series of Nancy Drew books, in that the main reason given was that they wanted to get rid of some of the cultural stereotyping. But it also seemingly was a way to get the page count down and get them a little bit more streamlined and to match the books that were coming out at that time in 1959, 1960, and beyond. And it also meant you could lessen the production costs if all the books were the same page length and same size, and they were coming out. They were ending the hardcovers with dust jackets and switched over into making the picture cover editions that we all associate with the series. So that there seemed to be a number of reasons why this was done, but I can't think of anything else in literature where an entire series of books was completely rewritten to varying degrees under the same title with a severe cut in page count by different authors over a time span that really is about almost 20 years. And again, all the books vary, so it varies from being slightly altered, having the same plot and the same title, to being heavily altered or having subplots added or making the main plot of the original book a subplot in the revised text. And then some are just completely different books that have the same title. So you have to go on a book-by-book basis. And doing this for the first time is really rewarding because, again, I can't think of anything else in literature, even not even just talking about series books and children's books. There's nothing quite like this. So you can actually go back and read the first 38 books of the Hardy Boys and the Nancy Drew books that were also revised. You can read the text back to back just to see the differences for yourself when it's two books with the same title, And of course, now that there are great fan sites and you can talk about this stuff or look it up online, it is so much easier to understand and know which book was altered more as compared to when I started finding this stuff out as a kid, just by suddenly finding two copies of the same book with different cover arts and the same title, but the books inside were totally different and had different page counts that differed significantly. So I just sort of started picking up this just by accident, and so now I'm finally doing what I always wanted to do, which is compare the text. But to do so, you do have to collect vintage editions of the older books, because once the revised text took over, the original texts were not reprinted except for the Applewood Books replica series that did the first 16 starting in 1991, which are now collector's items, and now the recent Dover publication of the original text of The Tower Treasure, Book 1. But that, of course, only means certain books you have more modern options. Everything else you have to track down vintage editions. So that's the sort of reason why I'm finally doing this reread. I like to reread this series every once in a while, every couple years, and really I have such nostalgia for them, but it's just a wonderful thing to do, even as an adult. And I have such great fondness for them, and they formed the backbone of sort of how I got into reading in the first place and reading voraciously. But I have been dabbling in the original text, and now that I have a good, solid original text version of each of the books, that's why I decided to start doing this reread series. So with The Missing Chums, we're talking about book 4 in the series, which was originally written in 1928 by the primary writer and really the creator of everything we know and love about the series, Leslie McFarlane. So he wrote this book in 1928 following the immediate success of the first 3 books, and it is very much the same experience in that it is much more two-fisted, a much grittier story. It's 1928, so it is a completely different time frame. But the plot of The Missing Chums obviously deals with the 2 primary friends of the Hardys, the supporting characters that Frank and Joe call on in pretty much every book. The immortal Chet Morton and Biff Hooper essentially are kidnapped. They turn up missing, and it is revealed that it's essentially tied in to the case that a world-famous private detective and father of the Hardy Boys, Fenton Hardy, is working on. But the gag of the story is the criminals were so dunderheaded in the kidnapping that they accidentally kidnapped the friends of the Hardy Boys and not the Hardy Boys themselves. The idea was to have kidnapped the Hardy Boys to put pressure on their father to drop said case. And they stupidly and rather amusingly grabbed the wrong 2 boys instead. So obviously the tension is still there, the suspense is still there, and for the Hardy Boys themselves, it gives them more personal stakes because it's their best friends that have been kidnapped, and so of course they feel duty bound to find them and rescue them. But that it's the inherent conceit that the criminals were obviously trying to capture the Hardy Boys and just screwed up. That it's always been something I really enjoyed about this particular book. And that is the same plot we have in the 1962 revision that was written by James Beuchler. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And what's great now is that due to all of the various bits of research that have been done in some of the reference books and all the great fan sites out there, we do have a good idea as to the identities of the ghostwriters. Of at least we pretty much know everybody who wrote the canon books, the 58 canon books that are considered the original series, and that includes the later books post book 38 that were all done once the revisions had started. So there's only one text of those. But this also means we know the authors of the original text too. So most of these authors wrote several different volumes. They usually didn't just do 1 or 2. So if you like particular books for some reason, you never knew why you gravitated towards certain ones over others in the revised text, it was most likely because they were the same author. So Beuchler wrote a number of other volumes in the series too. Again, this was written in 1962, so it was one of the earlier books that got revised. They seem to have at least tried to get the first couple ones in terms of the numbering, so like the first 5 or 6 done relatively early. They also were focusing on the ones that were deemed a bit more problematic, that they wanted to hurry up and update. And of course, that means these books that were not in print as long in terms of the original text getting suppressed much more quickly. It's usually harder to get copies of the original text because they were not around as long as some of the others that didn't get revised until, say, in the late 1960s. So, again, some of the original text lasted quite a while. Now, again, as I mentioned in the sort of brief plot description, that should sound familiar to all of us who grew up with the 1962 revised text. It is the same plot. This is one of the books where there's not a major subplot inserted. It is pretty much a rewritten version of the same plot, streamlined a bit, and of course we do have the reduction in page count. The original is about 215 pages, and the revised text is about 175 pages, so already there's the hit in page count. But thankfully, the plot is maintained perfectly. Now, the revised text does have a number of differences in terms of set pieces and characters and little side events and notable sort of action beats and things. This book is very fondly remembered by many in the fan community and myself as well. It's part of the early book, so it's number 4, so it still has a degree of sort of setting up the universe. I think any book series will have some of that. You definitely have that in the first 3 books of the Hardy Boys series in both original and revised text. But also Missing Chums, it's still book 4, so it's still sort of establishing some things. You get this sense much more when you're reading the original text or the revised text in sequential order. But there is a less degree of that in the revised text because it's actually written by somebody else and they weren't rewriting them in order. So when you look at these closely and you read them back to back, you can tell that it doesn't have as much of that sequential building on the books that came before aspect as the original text do. So Missing Chums has certain things in the revised text that people remember. Again, the plot is the same, but this is one of the most interesting ones I've come across so far because the 2 books are on the surface exactly the same. Some of the plot details differ a little bit. The revised text is one of the best revised texts. It's well written. It's been fondly remembered by people for generations now. The original text is the same story. It's extremely well written and much more vibrant, as all the original texts by Leslie McFarlane are. Once you read one of them, you'll know what to expect with the others. But this is, I think, the prime example, at least so far in my experience of doing these. I think this is the prime example if you wanted people to read just one example of the revised text versus the original text, and you were to try and choose what would be the best book for them to do. I think this one would be the best place to start because the plots are exactly the same. So it's definitely a case where people can get the real difference of the flavors of the original text and having the longer page length and being written in the 20s as opposed to the 60s, because I think it's much more apparent how different the texts are with the plot being exactly the same. Because quite frankly, I've said before in the videos I've done on the first 3 books that you can't really choose one or the other. They each have their positives, and that still applies here because I grew up with the revised text. It's still a wonderful book. It's beloved by many. It is a classic in the series, and it has great positives to it, along with some unique, very memorable moments. But without question, when you're comparing these books, this is the first time where I can absolutely 100% say that the original text wipes the floor with the revised text. And the revised text is great. That's not saying it's a bad book. It's still a classic, and I really enjoyed rereading it like I always do. But then I immediately went into the original text, and it's just no comparison. I've said before, McFarlane's original texts have a greater degree of grittiness to them. They feel much more lived in. They're much more two-fisted in terms of the intensity of the action, and he could really write a wonderful suspense set piece as well, which the intensity of the suspense set pieces are far beyond anything you get in the revised text, which still have their elements of danger and suspense, but you don't really feel the intensity of that. And I think a key example here is simply if you look at the names of there's a central island location that the boys find themselves in the story, in the hunt for their missing friends, who have been kidnapped or being held somewhere by a really dangerous gang that will most likely kill them very soon. But there's a particular central island location they find themselves at. In the revised text, it's referred to as Hermit Island. And so, reading the original text, I thought, oh, well, they probably just called it the same thing, because in books like this, where they didn't really change the plot, a lot of the names and characters will be pretty much the same, reworked a little, some of the dialogue tweaked or changed a little, and sometimes it's actually verbatim almost. So I figured it would be the same name. Oh no. Oh no, you would be mistaken, because in the original text it's actually Black Snake Island, named for being filled with venomous black snakes. And on top of that, the point at which the boys get to this island location is much different in the story. In the revised text, they get to Hermit Island pretty close to the end of the book, so it is getting towards the third act. And essentially they sort of go there, and they actually visit there more than once. They basically go there, turned away, and then get suspicious and go back. In the original text, it's much closer to the half point of the book, and essentially it turns into a completely different book once they get there, because they basically go in preparing for something is going to go down, and they are armed with revolvers, and they have to deal with the island being filled with venomous snakes and what they're going to run into. And then it basically turns into a suspense-filled book where they are directly confronting the gang members and trying to rescue their friends, and having gun battles and trying to not get captured and sneak into the camp. And the intensity factor is off the charts. It is the greatest example so far, and I think the perfect way to introduce somebody to the difference factors that can be in comparing the revised text to the original text. Again, the revised text is a great book. It's a classic. We all love it. We all grew up reading it. And it is well written, and it does maintain the original plot. It does keep some of the same events, and it does have specific things that are fondly remembered. I think most people will remember the bit about the costume shop that has different costumes in the front window display. And it's basically every time the Hardys investigate or go by, there's different costumes there, because the shop owner's giving signals to the other gang members by what costumes he's got up there and how he's got them positioned. So when the boys go by and all of a sudden there's two skeleton costumes in the front window, they have to wonder what sort of dark hidden meaning that has, and try and decipher the sort of code of what this is signaling to the gang. That's a wonderful gag, and it's one of the things I think most people will remember from Missing Chums. But that is part of the revised text. The original text is far, far more vivid, and again, I think the key quality is two-fisted. I don't know if people are quite as aware of what that term means these days, but I always associate it with being much more vivid and down-to-earth and realistic, and with the right doses of action and energy, and it's a story that really gets you invested in the sort of thrust of the narrative. McFarlane's writing is, I mean, I think it's truly beautiful. He had an incredible way in these books of making the stories full of action and suspense in the right places, but also feeling lived in. He had a great sense of being able to describe characters, but also the side characters and just random people the boys would meet. He also adds a great deal of humor that is beautifully rendered and completely natural. So, as an adult, you will be reading a Hardy Boys text from the 20s or 30s that McFarlane wrote, and you will frequently find yourself laughing out loud because the humor is so well done and so naturalistic. The boys themselves are also much more three-dimensional in that they have elements of sarcasm. There is this wonderful sort of, it's not quite an anti-authority streak, but they can very much think for themselves. And the police force in Bayport in the original McFarlane text is not always the most helpful. You would think they obviously don't want to deal with teenagers getting involved in mysteries, and especially here where it's two boys are kidnapped and being held for ransom. But they are also, frankly, more realistically portrayed as not the perfect law enforcement officers that are always referred to in the revised text. In the original text, everything is filled with shades of gray. It definitely is not the hard black and white approach of the revised text where it's all focusing on the action and set pieces, and otherwise everything else is perfect, and the Hardys sort of live in a idealized world, shall we say. That's always something that's thrown as a bone of contention, as a criticism against the series. But most people don't realize that originally it wasn't quite that way. That was part of the sort of streamlining of the revised text process. And again, nothing against the revised text. I still adore them, and I grew up with them, but I think this is the perfect example of understanding what the revision process did in losing a lot of the character and the flavor, the intensity of the books, not just in the action, but in the humor and the character portraits of the boys themselves. And these books are darker. Again, you just picture in your mind the idea of boys literally infiltrating an island that is filled with poisonous snakes, so much so that that's what it's referred to as. It's an island that is pretty much deserted. No one goes near it. And essentially, they're armed with revolvers, and they go in there, and they're having to essentially secretly camp at night and try and see if this is where their friends are being held. And if it is, they're going to be held by a very dangerous gang that won't stop at killing them or the Hardys if they capture them. And they may try and hold them for ransom as well, to then really try to get their father to drop the case he's on. So the whole narrative thrust of the book, it changes halfway through in an interesting way in the original text. You don't get that in the revised text. It's much more about getting to a point of, okay, this is the third act climax, and you're getting close to the 175 page count. So again, part of the streamlining process of the revised text was that significant cut in the page count, and that does mean you always have to have an increased pace. That is something you will always experience in the revised text. They move at a they move at a very good clip, in terms of a good speed, and there's not really a lot of breathing room. There's occasional little bits where they're not in yet another sort of cliffhanger at the end of the chapter, or dealing with the villains, or finding a new clue, or dealing with yet another subplot. So there are little character bits in the revised text, but they are drastically shortened and dramatically less impactful, because there isn't that extra page time in terms of having the greater page count and the ability to have a more, not necessarily relaxed pace, but a natural progression. When you compare these, you can always tell the revised text does move faster, and when it's telling the same story as it's doing here, it does. You can get that difference in terms of, you can definitely feel it. Again, this is an interesting case where, even though the books are telling the same story, the plot is the same, the revised text does actually come up with a lot of its own unique business. So even though it's not technically considered heavily altered, I do think the revised text is one of the books that does stand on its own, because it comes up with enough material that differentiates it from the original text. But you can't ignore the fact that the plot line is exactly the same. They end up at pretty much the same exact points. They do, have the boys go to an island at some point, past the halfway point of the book. But I do like the things that Beuchler did to differentiate the revised text. So the revised text is still a great book. I still love and adore it. I've read it hundreds of times over the years, and it's still a classic. But it's not the original text. Again, this is, I think, the perfect book to try out if you're curious about any of the stuff that I babble on about in these videos, or if you've heard about the original text and you just have never read one. I think it's also important to be sure and read one of the Leslie McFarlane texts. He didn't write all of the original text, but he wrote the great majority of them, and he was the one who pretty much created all of the series iconography. He was given the sort of premise and the idea of the characters originally, but then after that it was all him, and so he really is the father of the series. So those are my thoughts on rereading this true classic of children's literature. I think it's a great book in both forms, but reading the original 1928 Leslie McFarlane text was a dramatic difference. I thought in starting the series and after the first three books, where you can recognize the similar elements and you could recognize the strengths of the original text, I thought most of them were going to sort of follow that. I didn't think outside of the ones that were completely rewritten that there would be such a night and day difference. And then I started the Missing Chums, and I reread the text that I grew up with and loved, and had a lot of fun with the nostalgia of rereading that. And then I opened to page one of the original text, and just immediately you get the warmth of the McFarlane text, which again I had just experienced with the first three books. But then as I'm reading, I start to see things that are not there because they were exclusive to the revised text, and then the intensity factor starts to build. And then especially once they get to the island, that was it. I mean, it's the most dramatic difference so far of reading these. And I think without question, the original text is the finer book. It is better written. It didn't have the constraints of the revised text. So it's always not exactly a fair comparison. You do have to keep in mind these were written, on order essentially by the syndicate, and the writers of the revised text had even stricter guidelines they had to follow, and they were rewriting a book that already existed, usually, unless they were starting from scratch, as they did sometimes. So it's not exactly a fair comparison. It's not. But this one, without a doubt, and I still love the revised text. It's still one of the best revised texts, of the original 38 canon of the revised books. But boy, the original text just, I mean, there's no comparison. The intensity, the level of the action, the suspense, the humor, the warmth, the grittiness, everything that I've talked about the original text is on full display here, and it's just simply a great book. Not even talking about because when you talk about the Hardy Boys, and yes, it's a children's book series, but it's simply a great read. All the Leslie McFarlane texts are truly great reads. He was a great writer, and you can tell that he enjoyed what he did for a living when you read it. That's something I think you can only get from truly great writers, that they truly enjoy the craft, and you get that sense of warmth in his texts. And this one, there really is no comparison. You simply have to go and read the original text of The Missing Chums if you haven't read it before. It is a much stronger book, and again, the revised text is still a really strong example of what the revised text could do well. It's still a great book. I'm not saying that it's bad, but it is so overshadowed by the original text, especially when you read them back to back. And in this example, they are telling the same plot. So I think this truly highlights the differences in the terms of the sort of form of how the original texts were done and how the revision process was handled. And of course, there was a significant span of time between 1928 and 1962, and of course, two different authors with two completely different mandates. So it's a fascinating comparison to make, but I think in this case, without question, the original text is the better book. It is the better written book, but it is a phenomenal difference. I think this is a perfect starting point if you've always been curious about this, because again, the spine of the book, the actual plot is the same, and the original text doesn't have a lot of the fun things you might remember from reading the revised text growing up. So it is a true eye opener. I mean, all of these are, I think, and I think I've used that term more than any in making these videos, that it's an eye opener. But if you've never read one of the original texts before, they are truly something else. It's a whole different experience. And again, the original text is just blatantly a better, grittier, darker, more action-filled book than the revised text would ever have been allowed to be in terms of what the Stratemeyer Syndicate was wanting at the time. So in this case, even though they're telling the same story and the revised text is still excellent, the original text is the finer book. It is a incredible experience to read, and I wish I had done this project much sooner, because it's just it's a great book. It's just a heck of a lot of fun and so well put together. So now to talk about the different cover art designs, as I like to do in these videos. This will pretty much follow the exact same pattern, because the original cover was done by W.S. Rogers in the same design type as the first three books. We have a lovely natural surrounding, we have a direct event depicted from the book, and then the title is in red. So the layout is the same. It's got the same sort of it's a wonderful sort of look to it, because it's obviously a painting and all of the figures are depicted in an action sequence. And if you look closely, on first glance, this looks more like obviously a children's book, because you have two boys and it looks like they're just sort of running through a field, but then you look behind them and you see three adult figures chasing them. And so then that starts to add a little bit of danger. But obviously, the guns are not depicted that are actually in the story at this point. And also the boys look a bit youngish in the actual the actual character depiction. So this one I think is a little deceptive. If you look at it on the surface, it just looks like, oh, they're just running through a meadow or something. But if you look at it more closely, and especially after you've read the book of the original text, you can tell, okay, this is one of the scenes where they've been found out. The gang is after them and they're running for their lives. And, there is a suspense factor there. But I think it's an okay cover. It's, again, in the same sort of style, and it was, obviously still the original run. This is 1928. The series is only a year old. This is book 4. And all of the Rogers covers are like this, in that it's depicting something from the book. It may seem a little simplistic, but the more you look at it, the more it sort of grows on you, and you realize what part of the book he's depicting. In 1944, we got the sort of first version of, I think, the iconic image we all associate with this book, and that's the A.O. Scott painting for the reissue in the sort of yellow spine era. Now, this is a completely different rendering from a really dramatic scene in the book where the boys are in their motorboat, the Sleuth, at night in a sort of raging sea, and they see the figure off in the distance. And I've always loved the staging of this. Scott really did some interesting layouts and the covers that he did. For example, his cover House on the Cliff takes place from an entirely different vantage point, as does his Tower Treasure cover. I really love what he did. My problem with his covers are always that they have that slight cartoonish look to them, especially in the boys' faces. They're seen in profile and from behind, so obviously I think it looks a little better. And the scene is really dramatic, and you've got them in the pouring rain, and it's just pelting them. And it's a really great dramatic scene from the book, and this is definitely another cover that is really doing a bit of action that is only found in the original text. There is something similar in the revised text, but it's not quite the same. So I always thought that the cover didn't quite exactly fit when I was a kid. And then when I started finding out about this stuff and then realized that some of the covers were specifically more relating to the original text, well, it starts to make more sense. So again, it does have a sort of parallel in the revised text, but this is a cover going much more for the original text. But of course, this was redone when the revision started in 1959. Rudy Nappy was the most famous artist of the series, did most of the series covers, but he also wound up doing almost pretty much all of the revised covers for the most part. And in some cases, he had particular types at the time, the types of designs he was doing. But a lot of times he was, I would think, sort of assigned to do a revamp or just his own version of what was the cover in print at the time. This is one of those cases. So he redid the Scott painting, and this is the iconic cover image that I think we all associate with the Missing Chums. And here, as always, he put his own spin on it and added this incredible sense of sort of photorealism. I've always loved how he was able to paint the boys themselves, but also find details. And also, I think the drama of the situation is much greater here because it's a darker painting. It's not as bright as the Scott original. The sort of slightly cartoonish look is gone, and also depending on the print quality of the actual book edition you have, because they really vary in terms of the era of which they were printed, and some were printed better than others. I think the better printed versions of the Nappy art really pop a lot more, and so this one has always seemed the most dramatic, and it's burned into my brain. So if somebody says Missing Chums, I think of Rudy Nappy's cover. And again, interestingly, since this is basically an update of the Scott painting, this is pretty much also still kind of tied to the original text, and it was used on the copies of the original text that were done before the revision came in place. So this was apparently, it's done around 1959. The original texts were still being printed, especially as a tweed hardcover with the dust jacket with the Rudy Nappy art, and then shortly thereafter transitioned over into carrying the revised text. So this is an example where you can get a copy with the Rudy Nappy artwork that actually does have the original text if you get an old enough copy, or if you scrutinize carefully to see if it is indeed the original text versus the revised text. Now, this version is this is the cover that stayed in print, for many years, all the way up until 2016, when Penguin took over the series and decided to do their sort of relaunch covers of the revised text. So in 2016, we got the Ryan Brinkerhoff, I believe is the artist name, cover for the Missing Chums. So this takes the new updated logo they had done and used on the first three books, and still has a very stylized flavor, a slight bit of cartoonishness, and almost a sort of comic feel, because if you look at the way the cover's divided, kind of makes you think of comic panels, but it's also taking several elements, particularly the costume shop with the skeleton costume in the front window, and then I guess it looks like it's Frank here on the left, but in a different scene, and it's trying to create a sort of collage type effect of different scenes from the book, with the new stylized logo and things, and the black spine these had. It's an okay cover. I'm not a big fan of these, and they only did really, I think, the first 8 up to Cabin Island in this, and then I guess they sort of threw in the towel. I don't think they're going to do any more of them. So for what it is, it's okay. I do kind of like it a bit more than the first 2 covers, which I'm not really a fan of. But I do think the Secret of the Old Mill cover they did, which is just a particular scene, I think that's a better idea. This sort of mishmash of different scenes and elements from the story just feels a bit jumbled. It's still fine, but again, when you have such a beautiful cover painting by Rudy Nappy that had been in print since 1959, and I don't understand why you would change it. I mean, I get trying to attract a new audience, but it's still the same exact book text or the revised text inside. So it's still a book from 1962. So yeah, I wish they had just done a fancier printing of the Rudy Nappy art. But it's okay for what it is. But I'm just not really a big fan of the design layout. So that's it for the cover art. Now to talk about the editions that I have in my collection very quickly. My original text copy has the second cover art, and this, of course, is in the yellow spine design, advertising the Lone Ranger series on the back. If you open it, you'll find the orange Greta end papers, and this lists to Clue in the Embers, which would date this to about 1955 or so. Then we have the front piece artwork that's in the that's printed in there. Take the dust jacket off, you'll find the actual iconic hardcover tweed edition, obviously from the 50s, with the classic logo printed on as well. Now, my childhood copy is this beautiful picture cover example with the nappy artwork, and it is printed very, very vividly. So the colors really pop, and there's a nice amount of darkness to it. This is a great example of a later picture cover with a really nice, bold rendering of the actual cover painting. Sometimes they got the edges cropped a little because obviously they no longer have the wraparound spine, and the printing variations do cause a number of different issues over the eras of the actual different print runs. But this one has always really stood out to me, and this is a cover that you really want to get an edition that is really nice and bold. The back cover lists to Arctic Patrol Mystery, which would date this to about 1969. And of course, you have the iconic black and white multi-scene end papers. The front piece illustration has, of course, the famous skeleton costume in the front window. And of course, the revised text also had the handful of internal illustrations exclusive to them that are not to be found in the original text. To talk about printing variations really quick, my dad's copy from about 1972, because it lists to the masked monkey, it is a much lighter printing of the actual cover. Here's mine for comparison, and you can see this has a sort of... The actual cover seems to have a sort of film over it in terms of it's just a bit hazy. This is something you'll run into on a lot of the books, and sometimes is carried over to the flashlight editions, which also have differences and variations in the printing, like I'll get to in a minute with the example I have. Also, in the different eras of the books, depending on the years they were made and who printed them, the actual spine and back blue color does vary. So mine is a much bolder, bluer one, whereas my dad's copy is the sort of, it's not quite greenish, but you can definitely tell a difference in the blues. So this is just something to run into, and just as another sign of how these books were printed over an extremely long period of time, and there, of course, are going to be differences and things that appear. So this is just a key example of two picture covers that have a very different intensity factor, even though they both look excellent. But when I started looking at these and really started noticing the printing variations when I was growing up, it really started to spark my brain, and so I started looking for little odds and ends like that. And speaking of odds and ends, here we come to the flashlight edition that I picked up, simply because I had never owned this book in a flashlight edition. And this has the same flashlight sort of style that you're used to, because they started doing these, and kids of my age, and all the books in the 90s that were available and the 2000s, and most that are still floating around are going to be these flashlight editions, which are still nice and sturdy and iconic for their design with the actual matching spines and rears. But inside, of course, there are the revised text. But this example is screwed up in a number of ways that should be obvious to anybody who collects these or remembers these or has a number on the shelf. So the entire cover is off center, so the actual title is actually now on the printed spine. The actual flashlight is too big. It runs over into the cover far more than it should, and it's too big for just being a single-digit book, being book 4. But the actual rear cover is also off-center. As you can see, it's over on the spine area in terms of where it printed, so I guess this copy just went through the printing process completely off-center. But it's also very light in terms, I don't know how well this will come across on camera, but when you look at it, the color axis is slightly off, and it's also much lighter as well. So here it is versus my dad's copy, and already you can see the difference. And again, this isn't as apparent on camera as it is to the naked eye, but it is very, very obvious that this book was one of the ones where the flashlight edition had some issues. But then especially when you compare it to my own old copy, the difference in just the the bold striking factor that is here on the original on the vintage copy and just not here on this one. And this one, if my dad's copy was slightly hazy on the art, I mean, this is just really hazy. It's also quite a bit softer too. So that's something you'll run into. It's also, obviously cropped on the top and the sides. So these are things you'll run into with the flashlight books, but this was just one of the biggest examples I found because even the front and back are off center. It may also be because this is a later printing. This is actually from at least the 2010s, because when you flip to the back, it's actually got an advertisement for one of the later Nancy Drew PC games from her Interactive. So the flashlights were made for a great number of years, and they can have differences themselves. Usually the earlier copies from the 90s and early 2000s are a bit better made than the latest ones from like the 2010s, like this one, because I guess somebody just wasn't paying attention and they had a lot more goofs in them. And here, of course, is the 2016 Penguin, and it does have the sort of wraparound art design, which is kind of nice, but it is sort of wrecked by the black spine in the middle of it. Again, these changed the iconic blue spines to a black spine, which is still kind of a bizarre choice, but at least they had matching spines. Here on the rear, it carries over this sort of collage design. Again, slightly cartoonish like some of the books in this particular run of covers, and also giving you the impression of a comic book especially. At least it is doing elements from the actual story, and it looks okay enough, but I don't know, it has a slight... There is a slight generic quality to it, I think, and it doesn't have the real striking aspects of the earlier covers, and especially nothing is going to compare to a beautiful Rudy Nappy cover, especially on a book like this where it's been in print for decades and is the iconic image you think of when you think of the book. So it's okay. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it just is. I don't know. It just doesn't really do anything for me. And of course, the interior of the book is the same as the Flashlight edition, which is the revised text, except it has the updated title page with the new logo that I'm not a fan of, and then the updated copyright with the Penguin logo. And of course, the advertisement for the same Nancy Drew game. So I guess this had the same printing plates as the off-center Flashlight edition I have. So that's my overall views on this particular rereading of the classic fourth book in the Hardy Boys series, The Missing Chums, and doing the comparison between the 1962 James Beuchler revised text that I grew up with the 1928 Leslie McFarlane written original text. That is an incredible experience. So I hate to elevate one book over the other, but I think this is the most dramatic difference in terms of intensity and grittiness of comparing two of the books so far. I think this one is a distinct difference to the degree that the original text is, without question, the better book and the superior experience and telling of this story. But the revised text is still a great book, and I still enjoy it and have great fondness and nostalgia for it. And it is one of the really great revised texts. So that's not to say the revised version is a bad book, because it's not. But again, the difference is truly striking in comparing the original text to the revised text, and the things that were moved around and changed over time, and in the revision process by the Stratemeyer Syndicate starting in 1959. This is a clear example where it really did limit the impact of the book and the story that was being told. And it is a lesser experience. It does not have the same level of intensity. Some people have actually called this practice, this particular thing that they did, an act of literary vandalism. That might be something that some people might consider going a bit too far, but I can understand the argument they were making, because so all the things that were lost are things that made these books feel much more like actual fully fleshed out novels. They feel much more lived in the original text, and you do lose such a great deal of that flavor in the revised text. It's simply not there, or you get echoes of it that you wouldn't know about if you hadn't read the original text, or they're made glaringly obvious when you read them back to back, especially. So that's why I think it's such an important thing to do if you're a fan of the series, or if any of this sounds at all remotely interesting to you. So as always, I hope this has been fun and at least somewhat informative to hear me talk about my undying love and adoration for the classic Hardy Boys series. And I hope this encourages people to maybe try doing a comparison read for themselves, because not only is it extraordinarily rewarding and eye-opening, but it also is a means of making the books fresh again. If you've never done this before and you hadn't thought about rereading them, and especially if you're an adult, it's not like you can read Hardy Boys books out in public without getting a lot of stares, but I do it anyway, doggone it. It's a way of making the books fresh again, and you will find all kinds of bits of fun in having an analytical mind and really focusing on looking for differences as you're reading them back to back. It's I think the best way to make the series fresh again is to do this sort of comparison reread and go sequentially, reading each book, revised text and original text, and making comparisons and trying to decide for yourself which book you think is better. So I do hope this has been informative. I will continue with this series and hopefully have my thoughts on the classic fifth book, Hunting for Hidden Gold, up very soon. And so I just want to say, keep enjoying reading the classic Hardy Boys series. They are an iconic part of American literary history, whether people want to acknowledge that or not, because it is a children's book series. But that we are going on almost an entire century of the Hardy Boys now. So we're getting close to the centenary, which will be in 2027. So do keep reading the books, keep enjoying collecting them. If you have any thoughts or comments for me, please leave them below. I always enjoy being able to interact with other fans about the series. It's not something you get to do in everyday life, so it's great to see have Hardy Boys talk whenever you can. And so, as I always say on this channel, keep reading print books, keep supporting your local independent bookstores, and thanks ever so much for watching.